Welcome everyone who is joining us for this session on the Bartlett's Gender Equality Symposium. I'll share my screen in a minute and we will give it a start. So, welcome everyone. This is a day of panel discussions organized by the Bartlett UCL's Faculty of the Built Environment on the occasion of International Women's Day 2023, in order to promote and champion gender equality in the built environment field. I am Sol Perez Martinez, and I will be hosting the session on women writing architecture. In case you're just joining us, a little reminder, all sessions today are being captioned live by a professional human captioner. You can view the captions within Zoom by clicking Show Captions at the bottom of your screen. If you wish to view the caption on a separate browser window, please click on the link shared in the chat. This event is also being recorded. The recording and transcript will be added to the Bartlett UCL Faculty of the Built Environment YouTube channel and forwarded to registered attendees after the event. We encourage you to submit a question for the speakers at any point during the session by clicking on the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. Now to give a start. We organized this panel to celebrate the coincidence that in 2021, two women started at the same time two different projects with the same name, both related to ETH Zurich. This hour-long panel will have two presentations by the leaders of the projects, Anne Hodge and Helen Thomas, here with us, followed by a short conversation between the three of us. We will end with a Q&A, so please remember to post your questions in the chat box. If we don't have time to answer all of your questions during the session, no worries, we will answer them in our social media channels that will be noted at the end of this presentation. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I am Sol Perez Martinez, as I said before. I'm a Chilean architect and a researcher. I have a master's degree in architectural history from the Bartlett School of Architecture and a PhD in architecture and education from the Bartlett School of Architecture and the Institute of Education. For the last couple of years, I have been a module leader and lecturer at the Master in Learning Environments at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction. However, last year, I moved to Zurich to become a postdoctoral fellow at ETH Zurich as part of WOA. During my time in Zurich, I have had the pleasure to work with the two inspiring women we have in the panel today. Helen has rightly called our projects sister projects, which I like very much. Firstly, I am part of WOA, led by Dr. Anne Hodge, the leader of Women Writing Architecture, 1700s to 1900s, who will be our first panelist. Anne Hodge is an architectural historian and leads the ERC-funded group Women Writing Architecture 1700s to 1900s at ETH Zurich. She did her PhD at the Bartlett UCL and a postdoc at AHO Oslo. Her research focuses on architecture and gender, print cultures, perception, and travel in the 18th and 19th centuries. Also, I contribute, together with many other writers around the world, in the Women Writing Architecture platform, co-edited by Helen Thomas and Emilia Berset. Helen Thomas is an architect, writer, and publisher based in London and Zurich. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of Essex. Some of her recent publications include Architecture in Islamic Countries, The Hybrid Practitioner, Extracts, Women Writing Architecture, Architecture Through Drawing, Drawing Architecture. Together with Emilia Berset, she's the editor of Women Writing Architecture. So without further ado, I want to give the space now to Anne Hodge so she can present her project, Women Writing Architecture, today. So over to you, Anne. I will now turn my camera off to give the floor to Anne.
Thank you so much, Sol. I think, sorry, I'm sharing my screen. There you go. Thank you so much, Sol, for the introduction and for putting this session together. Thank you also to the Bartlett events team and to Bartlett as a whole for the invitation and organization of this great event. It's great to be back at the Bartlett, if only virtually. As Sol said, I'm the leader of WOA, Women Writing Architecture 1700 to 1900, which is a 5-year project based here at GTA, the Institute for History and Theory of Architecture at ETH Zurich. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the project setup and its aims and methods, as well as our work so far. We've been 2 years running now. So first things first, I'm not doing this project by myself. Sol has joined me almost to the day a year ago as a postdoc. It's been really fantastic to develop WOA with her help since. Elena Riga is the PhD in my group. And as you might guess from our names, we come from different backgrounds as well as disciplines, speaking and researching in 3 languages, English, German, and Spanish, and linking experience in architectural practice with the histories of architecture and art. The whole WOA group and its work are funded by a grant from the ERC, the Research Council of the European Union. These grants are meant to finance groups pursuing what they call groundbreaking research, also high risk, high gain research. That's also a quote from the funding call, which takes place at the frontiers of knowledge. While I'm hesitating quite strongly to claim that our work will change the world, if only it could, I think it's important to acknowledge that what we do is only possible because there are funding schemes such as this one, which challenge researchers to build quite bold hypotheses, perhaps also encouraging us to leave our comfort zones. So what is WOA's hypothesis? We argue that in the 18th and 19th centuries, so long before architectural training was open to them, women had agency in the architectural world. The canon and most textbooks used in history of architecture courses might not refer to women for this period. In most, you struggle to find 1 or 2. But we set out to find large numbers of those identifying as women between 1700 and 1900 who had something to say about the built environment. As the title of the project suggests, we search for this female agency through the practice of writing. In our case, almost always published writing, as is indicated that the authors were read and thus wielded some degree of influence. And that's very, very central to our project. So our premise is that from the start, we regard the women we read as potential architectural agents, whether or not they had any say in the professional design of any spaces. What counts instead are their experiences and influencing powers, the ways in which, through their writing, they made space. 2 things have to change for this hypothesis to be fruitful. First, we must rethink the very concept of architectural agent. Who do we consider as architectural agent, and thus as protagonists for the histories we write? Do we really think that only architects and their official critics decided how a space was used, understood, how it acquired meaning to other people? Are we really certain that only those holding power determined how life was lived in these spaces? If we agree, as I hope, that this is not the case, we must listen to those doing otherwise. Second, we have to give credit to these, let's call them other agents, to have had a voice, to have been listened to have been heard, to have had the agency and the influence to shift meaning assigned to spaces, to have critiqued what others created and thus made space. So we ask, who are we reading? Who are you reading to understand spaces of the past, their users and their constellations? We argue that histories of the built environment need to expand their evidence base to stay relevant today in a world of planetary challenges, including increasing polarity and inequality. This is not about doing away with what is commonly called the canon. That would be wasteful. It is also not about adding to it or window dressing it. It is about differencing it, to use Griselda Pollock's words, by means of what she calls an active rereading of its always present structuring other. We challenge the canon by bringing it into dialogue with other voices, decentering it in order to open up spaces for those otherwise not seen and not heard. The corpus we use for this is 18th and 19th century women's writing in English, Spanish, and German from Europe and Latin America to test our methods in connected yet separate cultural spheres. Travel writing has featured highly on our reading list so far because it was one of the genres most open to women for publication, as opposed to those genres considered perhaps more serious. You see a few examples here. We are also looking at political writing, household or gardening manuals, educational treatises or histories, and scientific writing. We know that writing and publishing implies some degree of privilege in the period we are considering, yet it was far more open than practice of designing and building architectures. It probably still is so today, I would say. So if we read more women, in our case, one could, I hope, apply this to other marginalized groups as well. We will then read more eyewitnesses. We will read more dwellers. We will read more users of spaces. We will also read more critics, experts, scholars, and thinkers. If we start from this to rebuild our corpus as historians, we will, by necessity, write histories differently. Essentially, we turn things upside down. Rather than starting out from the premise that women had no agency, we assume they did, and in large numbers. We credit them with having had a voice, with their writing having had an impact. We hear them and know that others at their time listened as well. It is our job as historians to find appropriate methods to learn to listen, to read their texts and understand what they tell us about their environments, about buildings, gardens, cities, and other spaces. So besides making visible the women and their writings, which we deem relevant to architectural histories, we also work towards developing a reading method to read differently. And this is what we have worked on with the WOA group and invited guests in a series of events over the past year. From listen to her, reading her, situating her, and writing her, or escribir de ella, we have invited distinguished researchers, both early career and more senior, to read with us, as well as to present their own work on women writing architecture to us. The time does not suffice now to tell you about each of these events and talks, but we have learned incredibly much. It's been quite a whirlwind, as I'm sure my team will agree. We have come far and built a network of scholars working individually on similar projects and developed our own approach, methods, and corpus. Our events have always been two-part. First, a private reading workshop featuring post-its and highlighters center stage in neon colors, as you see here, including loudspeakers and active readers in front of the blown-up texts, evidence of the performative reading modes we engaged with. In this manner, we have been collaboratively reading several texts by women from the 18th and 19th century. We explore this kind of reading with, as we call it, as a method to write inclusive histories which incorporate the experiences of those previously sidelined by architectural cultures. All speakers and respondents took part in this experiment. We are very grateful for their openness to it. We feel strongly that having read with each other and with her, the author, enabled a fuller and more profound discussion in the public colloquia which followed each of these reading workshops. Most importantly, we have begun to build the WOA network, because one thing is clear: we cannot have too many people listening to women writing architecture, reading with them and understanding how they saw architecture of the past. Connecting with researchers in this way has been one of the most inspiring, thought-provoking, and joyful parts of the project so far. Now we want to go bigger. We're organizing an international conference jointly with the chair of Martin Delbecke here at ETH. Listening in, conversations on architectures and landscapes 1700 to 1900 asks again, who do we listen to? We invite researchers to reconstruct conversations, real, imagined, and metaphorical ones, taking place in the 18th and 19th centuries in any region in order to diversify the ways we write histories of architecture. The call for paper is still open until the 10th of March, so please, anyone interested, do get in touch. All information is on our website, which I'm sure we will share later. Here's the link to the website. This is our hub where we post what we do. We also have a very active Instagram account, the handle you see there as well, jointly written, researched and curated by Sol, Elena and our brilliant student assistant, Lucy Delacoste. So please do follow us and get in touch with any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your presentation. Now I would like to give the opportunity for Helen to turn her camera on and to also share her presentation. Here I see Helen. Over to you, Helen.
Hi. So I love Sol's idea of joining us together, Anna herself and me, the Sisters in Women Writing Architecture, in conversation. womenwritingarchitecture.org and Women Writing Architecture, Female Experiences of the Built, 1700 to 1900. And this slide is from the very first presentation I gave about our project, showing the two projects together in March 2021. So I'll continue where I left off. What's in a name? There are lots of Helen Thomases in the world, and this Google search shows us the most famous one. Helen Thomas is an anonymous name. Anonymity is a strategy. In my incarnation of the name Helen Thomas, I am an architect with a PhD in art history and theory from the University of Essex, who has worked in and learned from various institutions. These include the Victoria and Albert Museum, Phaidon Press, and even the Bartlett, where I studied for a master's in modern architectural history. Now I belong to no institution, but occasionally manifest in some, including Drawing Matter and the Department of Architecture at ETH Zurich. Although the ambition for exploiting the potential of the internet to create an entangled creative realm has existed in my imagination for several years, it was not until the autumn of 2020 that the project really began. In joining forces with Sarah Handelman, then a colleague at Drawing Matter, the imaginary started to take on a formal reality in the shape of a design brief. By December, we were ready to hand this over to Lizzie Malcolm of Rectangle, who define themselves as designers of non-linear narratives. In the 6 months between commissioning Rectangle and going live, we worked with an advisory board to contact as many people as possible to invite them to contribute to what was at that point still an abstract idea. We were lucky to be supported by Mary MacLeod and Amal Andraus, who connected us to people like Mary Norman Woods, Anne-Marie Adams, and Despina Stratigakos, and other revered historians and teachers who made generous early contributions that form the backbone of our list. Our advisors also helped us to reflect on how to move outside our own realities, from our European location into the Southern Hemisphere and looking eastwards, as well as engage perspectives, including those of decolonisation and transgender experience, for example. This essential work, carried out at present by myself and Emily Apase as editors, assisted by Jae-hee Shin, is ongoing and incomplete, providing us with perhaps our biggest challenge. Live since the end of June 2021, womenwritingarchitecture.org is an online, open source, annotated bibliography of writing by women about architecture. Initially designed to serve as a resource for academics and teachers when creating book lists and searching for critics, for example, the intention was to make it easier to stretch and test the canon of architecture and its history. As it says on the About page of the website, this is a communal space, an entangled matrix for gathering, publishing, and sharing annotated lists of texts, for encouragement, for finding new writers, and for insight into what is happening in the vivid realm where women speak up for themselves. Each of the 3 terms in the name, women, writing, architecture, are under question as we ask, what is architecture when written about by women? Who defines themselves as a woman after Paul B. Preciado? And even, What is writing in our super social mediated age? At first glance, the landing page of the website seems simple, a list of text, which we call citations, framed by two slim columns, the blue one on the left called collections, the green one on the right named annotations, but it could also be confusing. Time must be taken and patience wielded to see all the parts, to use the filters or embark on a search, to tentatively click the first plus sign and compile a personal collection, then email it to people, to visit the forum and find out what we have been producing, to discover and browse through all the people and organisations who have already contributed to this communal venture, to participate even. Everyone is invited to participate in celebrating women writing architecture, even cis men. And on the right, you can see a short list of some of the men who have contributed to the bibliography. There are different answers to the question, how does it work? In a practical sense, each citation in the list is connected to at least one annotation or collection. In the image shown on the screen, an extract from the list of collections on the site is shown on the left, with a blue background. We have a selection of filters to aid exploration, for example, bookshops. One of our projects is to feature architecture bookshops in cities around the world, showing publications by women that they have in their collections. On the right is an image of and extract from the annotations list, which has a green background. A collection is a group of citations drawn from syllabi, events, bookshops, personal interest, and many other inspirations. Mindy Sue, always a model for us, has been promoting her book, A Cyberfeminism Index, over the last few months, and has contributed a collection. An annotation is an individual's response to a citation, a text, that encompasses their thoughts, opinions, and research. It can be anything from a couple of sentences about why the text is important, perhaps as what Sarah Ahmed calls a companion text, to an extensive illustrated piece of work around the citation that is developed through an editorial conversation. This method of addition to the list means that the system works best when suggested texts are the work of others, rather than by the authors themselves. In this way, the value of a text is created by the number of times it is meaningful to someone, chosen as part of a collection or collections, or annotated once or many times. This approach is inspired by the long spoons or long chopsticks allegory, which takes the dining table as an analogy for humanity. This image shows a citation card for Dolores Hayden's The Grand Domestic Revolution, one of the most popular and therefore valuable citations in the list. Another way of answering the question, how does it work, is to refer to an interpretation by Jagmer Kultur, part of which is shown here. Jagmer's ongoing project to describe what the site means to her gives us the most in-depth feedback we've had on how the site works so far. The way that Women Writing Architecture website develops as an annotated bibliography, as a web-based resource, and as a project is responsive rather than planned. Themes arise, such as that of translation, as we include more languages on the site. Emily, who is French, Jae-hee, who is Korean, and myself as a Briton explored the theme through the versions in our mother tongues of the 11th century book, The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. This work was done at the Furka Path as part of Jan de Wilde's independent residency programme, and this collection by us is one of the outcomes. The issue of translation and multiple meanings is fundamental to the working of the website. It is expressed in the glossary, for example, where the possibility exists for multiple definitions of each term. Most recently, it has inspired what we call the Glossator. This is a user-created, bespoke bibliography designed to be useful for personal research and for sharing with students, colleagues, and friends. This image comes from the process of development of the Glossator. It is based on the Talmud, where layers of interpretation are added in the margins of texts. It is also inspired by the medieval glosses that were made in the process of translation from the Latin into vernacular languages never before expressed in writing. The Glossator is a development of the personal collection. This was designed for users to make and share bespoke collections. This collection was made by curator Geraldine Tedder for her exhibition Space as Matrix, inspired by a text written by Susanna Toro. This is what happens when you press the Annotate Print button. In this Glossator, Geraldine reflects on her use of text and the relationships between authors in her marginal annotations. We are becoming increasingly aware of the importance of mechanisms such as a Glossator for enacting the website in the real world. When we were invited to contribute a list of books for the kiosk at ETH, we said, but we are already a list. Instead, we used fluorescent bookmarks to highlight publications by women. This transformed into the Book I Love podcast series, which can be found on the website. At the moment, we are setting up a Verein, or an association, to encompass women writing architecture. This requires a formalisation of strategies that have previously been largely spontaneous. So everyone is invited to participate simply by emailing us at editors@womenwritingarchitecture.org and initiating a dialogue. For suggestions for citations, perhaps, an idea that we haven't thought of yet, or a proposal for a collaboration. We have various initiatives that invite participation and suggestion. The podcast series, for example, or the Glossator collection. It is also possible to send us citations, which can already be on the list, or not yet there, either with an annotation or as part of a collection via our Participate page. We also produce a newsletter every now and then that can be signed up for on the About page. So that's it for Women Writing Architecture, part 2.
Thank you so much, Helen, for your presentation. I will ask now Anne also to join us in screen so we can have a little conversation while the audience that is with us today, thank you for joining us. Please post your questions in the chat. If you have any, use the Q&A function below. But just to start, it's so nice to be the three of us together here, celebrating both of your fantastic projects, and it's very exciting to see also what you're doing now. So first, I just wanted to ask Helen, like, I've seen the Women Writing Architecture website grow and evolve, and more people joining, which has been really exciting. But as you were saying, there is a project, it's an ongoing project, and it's responsive, which I think that is a really nice way of framing it. So I wanted to know if you could tell the audience a little bit more about, now that the site is fully running, you have a structure, you have the Glossator, what is the current focus of Women Writing Architecture? What are you working in now?
Well, as I said, we're setting up a Verein, or an association, which involves a process of formalising what we've been doing, which is, you know, kind of interesting. I guess in a way, it's what Anna had to do before she started her project, and so you know, that brings to the fore the notion of what value for us on the site. You know, how objects or citations are given value, which I touched on briefly. So very much, it's about what something means to different people. And then, but then also the notion of shared values. And I'm sure that's something that you and Anna discuss a lot in WOA. You know, we come from different perspectives and we bring different ideological beliefs with us. You know, so how, if you're working together in a communal way, how do you respect and share values without them being monolithic? specific. And so that's something also that's quite important to the website, but actually becomes quite difficult when you start to formalize it. And I think also inherent in what I said today is this notion, I think, and I really respond to your idea of the communal reading. I mean, is how do you make something which is quite abstract, like online bibliography, have meaning in the real world? And so this notion of the website as a mechanism that enables social action, I think is something that we're really interested in as well.
Thank you so much. And now just to ask you, Anne, so you talked a little bit about that this project WOWA is funded by an ERC starting grant. ERC is the European Research Council. And I know that these ERC projects are supposed to be groundbreaking. So I guess I wanted to ask you, what has been surprising during this last 2 years of research for your project?
Yeah, thanks, Sol. Yeah, so the ERC makes a big thing out of that they want high-risk projects, and it's not so straightforward and so easy to think in terms of risks in the humanities project and the historical project, I think. But looking back now to when I first wrote the grant, it's interesting that Helen, you just made that point, that the formalization sort of happened to me. I always can be more informal now than I had to be when I wrote the grant. Can change things now. But when I did that, I think this kind of big framework and a big challenge pushed me a bit to think outside of the box, maybe, and to make a point of not looking for women who designed buildings, not looking for women architects in some sense, or women designers, which is something that I still quite often have to explain when you are asked about what you do and you work on women in architecture in the 18th and 19th century, and then they ask, so what architects have you found? And we're not looking for architects, we're looking for women writing architecture. And the risk that I identified for the grant, because you have to identify a risk, is that we don't find enough women writing architecture or saying something significant that somehow can be related to some what we call histories of architecture in a more conventional sense. And I think the joyful surprise has been that's not a problem. We do not look for exceptions. We really find large numbers. So we identify texts that we think have potential, and there have been very few where we found on closer inspection that they do not have potential and they do not say anything on built spaces or landscapes that we find relevant and that we can relate and that expand somehow the ways we think about these spaces of the past and how they were experienced. So I think that's been really, in some sense, almost overwhelming, because there's no way that we can deal with all of this with our small team. We could easily keep working for another 10 years, probably, if we had the stamina and the funding. But I think that's been one of the biggest surprises, that's really not a problem. And the other surprising thing is probably that we've also found a lot of other people working on women writing architecture, but maybe not framing it that way and not looking at them collectively. And I think that's what we're bringing. That's really new as well, and that's been surprising as well, that you can look at women writing architecture, at women producing texts that have something to say about architecture and that did ascribe meaning to build space at the time. So we can write histories of architecture from these texts, that we can look at that collectively in large numbers. I think that's been a very positive surprise as well.
Thank you, Anne. And just finally, I just want to ask you something to both of you. Why writing? Why did you choose writing? I think that you mentioned a little bit, Helen, in your presentation, but it could have been anything. It could have been women drawing architecture, women acting architecture, women speaking architecture. So maybe if you could go first, Helen, why writing?
Why writing? Good question. So, I mean, I think for both of us, writing is where the canon is defined. So if you want to challenge what architecture is and who makes it, then that's where we need to start. But, I think what your question is really interesting, because it says, why not performing and why not drawing? And, and I was reflecting upon this issue, because, I do have quite a lot to do with architectural drawing. That's another one of my personas. you know, and I started to think, women drawing architecture, and you know, I mean, drawing isn't where the canon is made, so I think that's quite clear. But drawing, in a way, it isn't a language. It's where we don't need to make any translation in drawing. We can whichever language you speak, you can gather around a drawing and talk about it, and so yeah, I mean, and also what you have to do with a text, you can enter into a woman's imagination, into the way that she's thinking. With a drawing, it requires reading it in a different way. It requires words to be applied to it. So I think, bizarrely, even though it's quite academic, writing is a much more direct passageway into a way of thinking or an imagination. So, and I also think that writing is more easily made social. I mean, going back to what we've all been talking about in this session, is that, and something that I'm going to be arguing this afternoon in a workshop, can writing be activism? Where I think it can't unless it's made into a social situation. I think that's what both of us, you with your active reading, which is always done as a social thing, and the way that we're developing our work is this idea of making a social mechanism. So yeah, I mean, I am totally interested in translation. So writing for me in these states that it can move through is very, very interesting. But then when we were making the glossators that I showed briefly, we were testing them out, you know, having a go at making some. And I did one called Testing Oral History. And so I found that a really interesting learning opportunity to think about the relationship between writing and speaking and the limits and possibilities of this method of research. So I put in different search terms into women writing architecture, things like journals, letters and diaries, which I know are fundamentally important to your research. And of course, your annotations came up and the work of your students. But I think, you know, they are a form of speaking to yourself as well as writing. So there's always implicit within the writing this notion of speaking, which is social. And then also, when I put in the word speak, very important texts, which, you know, kind of push the boundaries of all sorts of conventional definitions of the centre, like let the subaltern speak and can the monster speak, came up. So yeah, I don't know, this, I think your question, why writing, not drawing or performance? I mean, I think somehow they're embodied within the writing. But I do like the idea of women drawing architecture. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of made quite
maybe
nice.
for a future project.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to encourage people in the audience who are with us today. Please, if you have any questions, please remember to put them in the Q&A. We'll be happy to help you join our conversation as well. So over to you, Anne. Why writing in your project?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's definitely good to have a project up your sleeve, Helen. I mean, it was really funny when we found out that we both had come up with the same title. I mean, it's really a good title, I think, so that's clearly why we did. But for me, it was, I think, to a certain degree, almost naturally that I chose writing. It evolved really from my previous work on the relationship between language and perception in a historical context. And then more recently, I've researched architecture in the 19th century press. So in a sense, what I did with the writing the grant proposal, again, thinking about, you know, doing something new, doing something different, going out, you know, doing something that's somehow can be called groundbreaking, whatever that might be really, is that I use my previous experiences and skills and expertise that I built over the years to contribute to writing these more inclusive histories of architecture, to getting an angle onto architecture histories that somehow changes something fundamentally beyond just building more corpus, more materials, making them accessible. And I've always argued that the ways in which we speak, or clearly how people in the past have spoken about the spaces they have experienced, that this language holds clues about the meaning of these spaces, the significance of these spaces, and to how we understood these spaces. And Helen, you've just referred to exactly that at the end of your response. I think this is clearly nothing new. Canons are made by writing. All historians use written sources. But if we then take into account that language is neither historically nor socially stable, so meaning that with people from different periods or with different social backgrounds express their experiences differently, then we can sort of decode and analyze this language or their writing as the obvious medium and practice to investigate. It's also quite important that what we look at is published writing, because it implies that someone else read it and it was received and it had an influence. And I think that's important. And it's interesting that Helen's project is very much a sort of editorial publishing project as well. It's about spreading further, and also has the reading response in there, which is so fascinating and so great. And I really encourage everyone to look at it and put your own annotations in there. So such a great, it's a conversation in a website. It's really nice. And then there's also something else I think that links very closely with Helen's approach, is that in some ways, and others not, but in some ways, writing is a more inclusive practice than drawing, definitely in a professional sense of architectural drawing, and definitely then architectural design, architectural practice as such. A woman could be a professional writer, could earn a living from writing, translating, especially editing, but also just writing, long before she could become a professional architect or even a draftswoman, anything to do with architectural practice. And still today, I think we find that many female architects turn to practices related to writing or editing to somehow surmount discriminations against their gender in architectural practice. So this is clearly not to say that writing is in any way not exclusive and doesn't have problems with exclusion. It means it needs privilege, and especially in the period, we're generally looking at privileged women who had access to getting their writings published. Although there's a variety, there's diversity in the women we look at. But there's clearly, there's always that as well. But I think in comparison to actual practice, it's a more open practice. And in terms of the exclusionary aspect, I think maybe that's something that projects like ours always also work to, and looking towards the future rather than the past. Especially Helen's project, I think, is something that might do away with that.
Thank you, Anne. We have a question from Professor Jane Randall. Thank you, Jane, for joining us. So I'm going to read it out. It says, thanks for sharing the wonderful work. It is really inspiring. It is great to see how these projects are shared endeavors and conversations. They both connect with the website I've been curating, sitereadingquarterly.co.uk. Collective practice is really important in the history of feminism. A big part of this was consciousness raising. Is this part of either of these projects? So who wants to go first?
I had a quick look at the question, and does Jane mean the site writing website, or the issue of collective practice? But I guess you could answer in both ways. So because I would love, I've come across obviously site writing, site reading and writing through people's site writing that have come from Jane's website. And interestingly, often, some of it has been through another project I'm involved in, which is called TAC, which is looking into the notion of tacit knowledge. And I think this relates to the question you were asking earlier about writing being about contributes to conventional knowledge structures, whereas drawing is much more about tacit knowledge. And as I was thinking about it, what Jane's doing, the site writing project, is actually almost like a bridge between the tacit and the explicit, or the academic knowledge. But it would be great to have a representation of the site reading writing quarterly on women writing architecture. So yeah, I mean, if Jane wants to be in contact and we can make a collection or have annotations, but there are some references already on the site, which are, I think site writing might even be a theme, I'm not sure, but yeah, collective practice.
And then the other part of the question is more about consciousness raising. So if we either of the projects include an aspect of consciousness raising as a collective practice.
Helen, do you want to?
Yeah, do you? Okay.
I'll jump in. Yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, collective practice is clearly totally central to what we do. I mean, we develop our method collectively by these reading workshops. And it's really interesting how collective reading or collaborative reading, how the joint reading, the reading with, changes one's reading. So I've done this, and we've read texts that I read, many of times before, and then we do this collectively, short extracts, and we read sentence by sentence, and we give different tasks, and I read with other people, and I sort of read through their minds or listen to their conclusions. But just by being in a space together and reading short extracts very together, you see new things, even just from myself, and then clearly you hear what other people are thinking about. So this is this collaborative, collective reading is really very fascinating. I think it's something that how you can approach texts that where the canon doesn't tell you these are relevant for the history and for your discipline. This is something that we have to make an argument. We have to find a way of explaining and justifying that they are relevant for our discipline. And I think that's linked to consciousness raising, because it increases that consciousness of what are the sources that we can look at, and how can we, generally if you ask about the textbooks on architectural histories quote mostly men in the before 1900 or even after, white men, privileged men, it's Eurocentric or Western centric. And the response, and then that you can't quite get around that, because there were no other architects, and what can you do? And all important projects were built by them. But the way around that we're trying to find around them, and I think that's a sort of increasing awareness or increasing consciousness that you can get from that, is that if you shift the focus not on the production of the important buildings, but rather their reception and the reception of all the other spaces as well, and how they were lived in, how they were experienced, and how the meaning was created for them, then I think you get to that, and to raise that idea, to get that into people's minds, then opens up the door for all sorts of other histories. It's almost too big what you open up then, but that's another matter. So thanks for that question, Jane.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I think that also we've all been trying to integrate different bend modes and different ways of relating to others and sharing our content. And I think that that's also another way of consciousness raising, like through our workshops, through the event that Helen as well does with her team of women writing architecture. We're trying to find new ways of meeting people and new ways of creating content. And I think that idea of creating knowledge together has been something that both projects explore at breadth, and it's really nice to see that work. So we have another question now from Lorica Hisari. She says, thank you for your presentations. It's fascinating that you do what you do. I wanted to ask if and what was the feedback and or engagement of men towards your projects? Thank you. So that's a really good question. I think that Helen touched a little bit on it through her website as well. So Helen, if you want to go.
Well, yeah, men always go, ooh, they don't know if they're invited to join in. So yeah, we want to hear men celebrating women. Of course we want men to join in. So yeah, I mean, they're intrigued, but of course, I mean, it's a good question, because you only speak to the men who are already interested. So I guess luckily we haven't had any negative hate mail on the site or emails, or and I guess quite a lot of projects that promote women do have that. Maybe our women writing architecture is a bit too niche for for that to happen. But the men who have engaged, it's been more that they feel that they're not invited. So we make so much effort to invite them, and I'm sure you do too. I mean, I've been in your collective reading, and it's like there's a good gender split. So I mean, and I guess that is also consciousness raising by by having men involved. I mean, this consciousness raising question is really fascinating, and I guess for whose consciousness do we want to raise? I use the key question for me, like there's speaking to the converted, and then there's the people who aren't converted, and the consciousness raising, I guess, has more value amongst the unconverted. But how do you actually get in amongst that crowd? And then that would be the real test. If you're in that crowd, then you'd be tested on how you were. How men were responding to your project. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's a provocation for sure.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And as you say, Helen, we've always made a point of not having women. Well, we had one woman-only event, but that was a different type of setting. So there's a space for that, for women-only events, which I think is powerful and important. But for our public events here at ETH, we've always made a point of trying to have male voices there as well. Ideally, also men working on women, because clearly not only women should work on women. I mean, there's so many women working on men, so why not the other way around? So there's no reason for that. There to be a gender split and it to be an exclusive female space. So that's very, very important. In terms of, it's interesting in terms of the teaching that I do. If I teach classes on gender and architectural histories, I do get majority female students, and those identifying as female, and that's I've tried to address that and make it clear that this is an open space, that this is not addressing only those identifying as female, and it's starting maybe to change. I think I'm seeing greater diversity in that direction in classes, but it's very slow. But maybe that's also a call for to make it explicit. Maybe it just needs to be more. We need to be more inviting and more explicit. That we are not a female-only space, even though it is powerful and important to have female-only spaces. So that's, I think, my answer to this.
Yeah, I think that is a really important question that we discuss often, and I've seen at least a very positive response from colleagues and interest, understanding that listening to these voices is a source. These are historical sources which are highly interesting, very new. They give you new views into the architecture and the built environment and the landscapes of this time. So in my view, I think that our colleagues are responding very positively. Yeah. But as Helen and Anne point out, I think that we also, as a women writing architecture group, of course, women is in the front. We have to build those bridges, and we've been working on building those bridges to get more diversity as well of people talking about women's writing, women's work, because it's just as relevant and as anyone else's. So yeah. I think that was something that
can I add one thing? I've actually had on that note, and in terms of positive response from colleagues, I've had several colleagues, and I think there were some who attended our workshops, our reading workshops, have remarked on that, but I've also specifically had remarks on how this opens doors on looking at other writing that's not sort of comes from the architectural sphere, the professional sphere, critics, architects, and so on. That there's other political writing, especially that's done by men around the French Revolution. That one could look in that sense as well and read with these methods. So I think that's quite interesting as well, and that's really what I'm hoping, and that's what I added sort of as added value of the project. Thinking again about the grant application, all that this is not something that you can use exclusively, and it's not a method that you can use exclusively for women, but also for other marginalized groups. So that's the key point to make here as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anne and Helen, for being with us today. And thank you so much for the questions from the audience, from